It is a moonlit night on the southern plains, and somewhere in the darkness a Comanche war party is riding toward you. Not to kill you. Killing you is the easy part. That comes first, and it comes fast. What they intend to do to the people they take with them on the long ride home is the reason grown men on the Texas frontier slept with a loaded pistol on their chest, and one round saved back for their own wife. These riders can cover 80 miles in a single day. Some of them have traveled almost 1,000 miles, the distance from Dallas to Denver, for one raid, on one ranch, on one family. That is not a war party. That is a debt collector who has ridden for a month to knock on your door. So why would grown warriors ride the length of a country to slaughter a single family they had never met? The killing was not the point. The killing was the beginning. Comanche revenge was not an act. It was a ceremony that could last hours, days, sometimes longer, and every step of it was designed to answer a specific wrong on a specific ledger you did not even know you were on. And here is the part almost no one tells you. The most feared moment in a Comanche captivity was not the moment the warriors caught you, it was the moment they handed you over to the women. Because the warriors killed, but the women, the wives, the mothers, the widows of men your people had killed, they were the ones who took their time. Before we are done, you will understand exactly how Comanche revenge worked, the logic of it, the ritual of it, the specific acts on the return trail and around the campfire, and the single spark in a room in San Antonio in the spring of 1840 that set 600 riders loose on the Texas coast. If you want the parts of American history the textbooks flinch away from, the raids, the reprisals, the frontier as the people who lived through it actually saw it, the like and subscribe buttons keep this work coming. Now, back to that moonlit ride, and how it started. There is a stretch of country between the Red River and the Rio Grande that once belonged to almost no one, and briefly, to the Comanches. They came south out of the Rocky Mountains in the early 1700s on horses they had learned to ride better than any people on the continent, and they took the southern plains the way an ocean takes a shoreline, slowly. Then, all at once, the Apaches were driven out, the Tonkawa were pushed into a corner. The Spanish, then the Mexicans, then the Texans, learned that the flat grass horizon in front of them was not empty. It was patrolled. By the 1830s, you could ride across northern Mexico for weeks and pass villages where every adult had lost a cousin, a child, a spouse to a Comanche raid. Full moon nights emptied the streets. Mothers slept with infants pressed against them, listening. One Mexican, walking through the aftermath of a season of raids, said the raiders had left behind 1,000 deserts, a phrase so exact it survived the century, because the villages were still there, and the people were not. The people on the receiving end were not caricatures. The Tonkawa were a small tribe of central Texas, farming and hunting in villages, who signed on with the Texas Rangers as scouts because they had no other card to play against the Comanches, pressing them from the north. The Mexican soldiers riding out of Chihuahua were conscripts on tired horses, badly paid, badly fed, ordered to chase men who could ride 80 miles in a day. The Anglo settlers were farmers from Alabama and Tennessee who had crossed a river looking for cheap land. None of them understood what they had walked into. Then came March of 1840, and a room in San Antonio, and a decision by a group of Texans that would put 600 riders on the road to the coast. That is where our story starts moving fast. Understand what a Comanche war party actually was, because Hollywood has been lying to you about it for 70 years. They were not a wave of screaming figures on painted ponies. They were the most efficient mounted killers on the continent, arguably in the world at that moment, and they were organized around a single unromantic principle: get in fast, do the work, get out faster. A raiding party could be 20 men, or it could be 600. Every rider brought a string of horses, 3 or 4 each, so that a single warrior always had a fresh mount waiting. This is the arithmetic of the plains. The reason a Comanche column could move 60 to 80 miles in a day and Mexican dragoons on a single tired horse never caught them. They carried short, powerful bows that could put an arrow through a buffalo, and increasingly, guns traded from Comancheros or stripped-off dead Texans, lances, knives, and rope, because they did not always come for the kill. Their homeland ran from the Arkansas River down through the Texas Panhandle and deep into what is now northern Mexico. From that base, they could strike in any direction on any month of the year, and they did. Here is what to hold in your head as we go forward. When a Comanche war party rode into a Texas ranch, the ranchers were not fighting the local Indians. They were fighting the finest light cavalry that had ever existed on the Great Plains, ridden by men who had trained for this since they were 4 years old. It was not a fair fight. It was never a fair fight. March 19, 1840. San Antonio de Bexar. A delegation of Pennateca Comanches, chiefs, warriors, women, children, rides into town under a flag of truce to negotiate the release of captives. There are around 65 of them in total. They are shown into a stone building near the courthouse. Texan officials are waiting inside with soldiers in the courtyard and more soldiers in the surrounding streets. The Texan demand is simple. Give up every white captive you hold, right now, or none of you leaves this room. The Comanches have brought one captive, a young woman named Matilda Lockhart, whose face and body bear the marks of what she has been through. They do not have the others. Different bands hold different prisoners. That is not how a demand for total surrender wants to hear it. So the Texans order the doors closed. They tell the chiefs, through a translator, that they are under arrest. The chiefs pull knives. Someone fires. In minutes, the room is a slaughter. 35 Comanches die in and around the courthouse. Chiefs, elders, women, children. 7 Texans die with them. Comanche women watching from outside are cut down in the street. Understand what has just happened from the Comanche side. Their most senior leaders, come in peace under the oldest and most sacred of frontier customs, have been murdered under a flag of truce, along with their families in front of them. On the southern plains, there is exactly one answer to that. But here is the detail almost no one includes. Among the dead in that courtyard were Comanche women and children who had come along not as pawns, but because the delegation had believed, right up to the moment the doors closed, that this was a peace meeting. The war party that would ride to the coast 5 months later was not just avenging chiefs, it was avenging wives. And on the plains, avenging a wife was the wife's family's job. Somewhere in the western plains, sometime in the early summer of 1840, a council fire is burning. The senior warriors of the Pennateca are gathered. The names of most of the men who spoke there did not survive. The decision they made did. And the decision was not whether to take revenge. That was not a question a Comanche could seriously ask after San Antonio. The decision was how far to ride and how much of Texas to burn on the way. Some argued for small strikes on nearby ranches, quick, safe, close to home. Others argued for something no war party had attempted before at this scale, a ride of hundreds of miles all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, into the settled heart of the Republic of Texas, straight through country patrolled by militias and rangers, 600 warriors, their families riding behind them. The kind of raid that either becomes legend or becomes a grave. And there is one more thing on the ledger, older than San Antonio. Somewhere back in the previous generation, a Tonkawa war party had killed and eaten the brother of a Comanche chief. The Comanches, for all the horror written about them, considered cannibalism a filthy, unspeakable act. That brother was not forgotten. When the war party rode, one of the understandings between them was that any Tonkawa scout they caught on the trail would not simply be killed. A story was already told among them of a captive made to dig his own 5-foot pit, buried to the neck, scalped, and left with his eyelids cut away for the sun and the ants. A torture recounted. One witness later wrote, as an excellent joke. That was the standard. That was what a serious grievance was answered with. Whether the council ended with a single speech or a slow consensus, historians have argued for a century. The result is not in dispute. In early August 1840, 600 riders, warriors, some women, extra horses, packed provisions, turned their faces southeast toward a coastal port most of them had never seen. They rode with a specific list of debts to collect. They were not going to negotiate. Picture the column. 600 men on horseback, plus women, plus a herd of remounts moving with them. From a mile away, it would have looked like a slow, brown smear on the grass, dust hanging in the still August air. From closer, you could hear it, the tack, the hooves, the low talk, the occasional bark of a dog moving with the camp. They rode in the early mornings and the late afternoons, and lay up during the worst of the heat. This is a lesson in Southern Plains logistics that no Texan officer had bothered to learn. They crossed the Edwards Plateau, they crossed the Guadalupe, they crossed old Comanche traces most whites did not even know existed. For a war party of this size to move undetected across 250 miles of increasingly settled country is, in retrospect, astonishing. It happened because the settlers were not looking east from the frontier, they were looking north. No one ever had ridden this deep into settled Texas from the plains. It had not been done. The Comanches did not know it was impossible, so they did it. Stop and picture this for a second. 600 riders and thousands of horses moving through the country between San Antonio and the Gulf, and no one saw them coming until they were on top of the first ranches. Every alarm system the Texas frontier had, every scout, every ranger, every rumor, had failed. The first Texans who understood what was happening were the ones already dying. August 6, 1840. The town of Victoria wakes up. Men are already in the fields. The heat has not yet cracked. The shadow of the buildings still stretches long. Somewhere out beyond the last fence line, a rider notices dust that does not belong to any wagon he knows. Then the shape of the dust resolves into horses, then into riders, then into hundreds of riders. The war party hits the outlying ranches first. Men working the fields go down where they stand, some shot, some lanced, some cut down as they run for the houses. Horses in the corrals are the second target. 100, 200, 300 are cut loose and driven off. The riders are not looting yet. They are killing the resistance and taking the mobility. Then they come into town. For a few hours, Victoria is inside the raid. Homes are entered, stores are looted, men caught inside are killed. Women, in the language of the frontier accounts, were raped, some killed outright. Older children and younger women are taken as captives. Several dozen settlers die inside a single morning. And then, this is the part that made Victoria different from every previous raid. The war party does not leave. They ride out, they come back, they do it again. They know no relief force is coming for hours, maybe days. Here is the number that should stop you. Several dozen settlers dead, hundreds of horses gone, captives roped and taken. Total time the Comanches spent inside Victoria, Texas, a matter of hours. In the time it takes a modern person to watch 2 films back to back, a Texas town was gutted, because the logic was not personal, it was cultural. The historian S.C. Gwynn, drawing on nearly 2 centuries of frontier testimony, summarized what a Comanche raid on a settlement actually meant. The automatic thing in battles, adult males would be killed. That was automatic. That's one of the reasons that Indians fought to the death. The white men were astonished at it, but they were assumed that they would be killed. Most, the small children were killed. Very small children were killed. A lot of the, say, children in the 3 to 7 or 3 to 10 range were often taken as captives. The women were often raped and often killed. That is not one raid. That is the template. After Victoria, the Comanches move south. 25, maybe 30 miles between them and the next target, a ride most rangers would consider a hard day. For a Comanche war party loaded with plunder and horses, it is an afternoon. They move down toward Lavaca Bay. Some captives ride tied to horses. Some walk. Some, the accounts suggest, are already dead, killed on the trail because it was easier than dragging them further. and the country ahead of them still does not know they are coming. Behind them, back around Victoria, the accounts begin to accumulate. Bodies in fields, bodies in doorways, homes still smouldering. It is the beginning of the image that would be repeated up and down the frontier for the next 30 years, the image the Mexican witness had already given a name to. 1,000 deserts. Understand what is happening in real time. A war party that had been thought impossible has just proven itself possible, and it is not finished. The people of Lynville are, at this very hour, going about their business, checking manifests, loading boats, laying out goods for sale, with no idea that 600 riders have already crossed the last river between them and the coast. Lynville was not a large town. It was a port, warehouses, a customs house, homes strung along the water where Lavaca Bay opens toward the Gulf. Cotton, tobacco, hardware, cloth. The goods that were being shipped inland to the towns of central Texas passed through Lynville first. On the morning of August 8, 1840, the warehouses were full. The alarm, when it came at horseback speed. A rider from the direction of Victoria, then a second, then the sight of the war party on the horizon coming down out of the grass. The residents of Lynville did the only thing that could be done. They ran for the water. Every boat in the bay was hauled offshore into the shallows. Men, women, children waded and swam out to the boats and stayed there in the water, holding on, sometimes for hours, while their town burned in front of them. What happened next is one of the strangest images in 19th century American history. The Comanches, having taken the town without meaningful resistance, spent the day going through it. They looted the warehouses. They opened crates of cloth and clothes. They dressed themselves in top hats, in umbrellas, in stovepipes and dress coats and bonnets, and rode through the ruined streets of Lynville costumed like guests at a shipwrecked wedding. Bolts of ribbon streamed from their horses. They fired guns in the air. They dragged bound captives behind them, and every one of the residents in the bay, floating in the shallow water, watched. They burned Lynville down. Warehouses, homes, the customs house. Property loss ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars, an astronomical figure for 1840 Texas. Human losses at Lynville were lower than at Victoria, only because so many people had made it to the water. The captives who had not made it to the water were now roped to horses moving north. Sit with that image. A town on fire, its inhabitants standing chest-deep in the sea, and Comanche warriors wearing the dresses and top hats of the people they had killed, riding through the smoke. This is not a scene from a movie. This is a scene from a Texas history book, and the descendants of the people in that water still live in that county. The war party turns north. Behind them, 2 burned towns, dozens of dead, hundreds of horses driven ahead of the column, wagons captured and loaded with looted goods. In front of them, 250 miles back to the plains, and every mile of it now country that knew what had happened. This is the moment when Comanche revenge, as a specific ritual practice, actually begins. Because the killing at Victoria and Lynville had been fast, it had been the raid. What comes next is the punishment. In the language of the historians who compiled the frontier accounts, when the warriors believed they had put enough distance behind them for security and they could make a camp and light fires, the second phase began. That is the sentence to remember. Distance, then fires, not before. By the second night on the trail, the captives understood what the trail was for. Female captives were held under guard through the day and passed among the warriors at night. Male captives, those adult men who had not been killed at Victoria, were kept alive for the camp, or, if that seemed impractical, dealt with along the way. The specific practices documented in 19th century frontier accounts, some of them recorded by survivors, some by Mexican and American officers, are unsparing. The Comanche roasted captive American and Mexican soldiers to death over open fires. Others were castrated and scalped while alive. The most agonizing Comanche tortures included burying captives up to the chin and cutting off their eyelids so their eyes were seared by the burning sun before they starved to death. Contemporary accounts also describe them staking out male captives, spread-eagled and naked over a red ant bed. Sometimes this was done after excising the victim's private parts, putting them in his mouth and then sewing his lips together. That is not one report. That is the intersection of many, told across a century. Here is the piece that changes everything. These acts were not madness. They were not a warrior in a fury cutting where his knife happened to fall. They were rituals, done in specific orders with specific meanings. And the people who most carefully performed them were the people you would least expect. In Comanche society, the raid was the work of men. What happened in camp after the raid was often the work of women, widows, mothers whose sons had not come home, wives whose husbands were killed in the last cycle of raid and reprisal. The women had grievances, and by long tradition, some of those grievances were answered by them personally, with a knife, at a fire, when male captives were brought all the way back to the encampment. The standard practice, the practice repeated in dozens of frontier accounts and modern histories, was to hand the captive over to the women of the tribe, often the women who had lost the most in the previous fighting. What followed was ceremonial, and it was slow. One 19th-century account drawn from frontier testimony describes what a captive could expect. If there were male prisoners, the normal practice was to try to bring them back for the pleasure of the women. When this was impractical, they were killed on the trail. It may have been the exercise of vengeance against their lot in life, but at any rate, the females destroyed the captive by the most drawn-out and hideous means they could devise. They cut off his fingers and peeled his eyes. They stretched his tongue and charred his soles, and they invariably devoted fiendish attention to his penis and testicles. The torture went on for hours, even days, so long as the body survived. Read that last clause again. As long as the body survived. That was the target, not the death, the duration. This was the answer to the first mystery. Why ride 1,000 miles for one family? Because the killing was not the revenge. The killing was the price of admission. The revenge was what happened after, in a place your people would never reach. Over a period of time your body was engineered to prolong. A rifle shot ends a grievance. This did not end a grievance. This paid one, and it was not always male prisoners. It was not always adults. A contemporary account, one of the most difficult passages in the whole 19th-century record of the American frontier, describes the fate of a group of younger captives at a return camp. One by one, the children and young women were pegged out naked beside the campfire. They were skinned, sliced, and horribly mutilated, and finally burned alive by vengeful women determined to wring the last shriek and convulsion from their agonized bodies. Historians dispute how common these extreme acts were. They do not dispute that they happened, and the Tonkawa, the Comanches, never forgot, the small tribe whose scout had once eaten the brother of a chief. When any Tonkawa fell into Comanche hands during these years, the ritual around the fire was longer and older and specifically shaped for them. But then, and this is the reversal, almost no one who writes about Comanche brutality is willing to sit with the frontier the Comanches rode across, was not a moral vacuum with only one villain in it. Texas Rangers had already massacred entire Comanche villages. Mexican soldiers had already tortured Comanche prisoners. And in the fields of Plum Creek, less than a month after Lynville, the men riding to catch this war party were carrying grievances of their own. August 12, 1840. The country north of the town of Lockhart. The Comanche column is strung out over miles. Warriors in the vanguard, captives and horse herds and looted goods in the center, more warriors bringing up the rear. The problem for a war party is that 600 riders and thousands of horses cannot move quickly when they are dragging a bay town behind them. They are slow. And Texas is no longer surprised. 250 Texans hastily assembled, militia, volunteers, rangers under Ben McCulloch and Edward Burleson, intercept the column near Plum Creek. They are outnumbered more than 2 to 1. They attack anyway. The fight is not a battle in the European sense. It is a running skirmish spread over miles of prairie and creek bottom. dust and gunfire, and men on horseback disappearing into brush and reappearing somewhere else. The Comanches, weighed down with plunder, cannot maneuver the way they usually would. Some abandon the horses, some fight to hold what they have taken, and die holding it. Dozens of Comanche warriors are killed. Hundreds of horses are recaptured. The Texans, when they come off the field, believe they have exacted the answer for Victoria and Lynville. The dying on both sides are given no mercy. One 19th-century Plains warrior's account, preserved in a later frontier narrative, describes an aftermath scene from a comparable running fight in this same period. Next, a great many of the dying enemy were gasping for water, but we heeded not their pleadings. We scalped them, amputated their arms, cut off their legs, cut out their tongues, and threw their mangled bodies and limbs upon their own. That is not a Comanche testimony about whites. That is a Plains warrior describing a Plains battle. This was the norm of the theater. But the Comanches did not fully break at Plum Creek. Much of the war party escaped. They took captives with them. They took horses. They took the memory of the raid home. And from the Comanche side, the ledger looked different. Victoria and Lynville had answered San Antonio. Plum Creek was simply the next entry. This is the point almost every version of this story misses. The Great Raid of 1840 did not end the revenge cycle. It escalated it, and every side, Comanche, Texan, Mexican, Tonkawa, walked off the field of that summer with a longer list than the one they had walked on with. The war party that made it back to the plains rode into camp with a smaller herd than they had left with, and with fewer warriors than they had ridden out with, but they were carrying stories. The burning of a bay town, costumes taken off dead merchants, captives roped to horses, rifles taken, debts paid, rituals completed on the trail and in camp for weeks after. Somewhere in those camps that autumn, on nights when the wind came off the plains cold and dry, the women who had lost sons at San Antonio sat by fires and did the work that had waited 5 months to be done. This is the part of the record that survives only in fragments. The Comanches did not write. The captives, if they survived, wrote after, and rarely. But the ledger, on the Comanche side, was momentarily closed, not permanently. Nothing on the southern plains was ever permanently closed. The next raid was already being planned, the next grievance was already being formed, in the minds of men riding home and rangers riding back. The morning after Plum Creek, the country between the coast and the plains was full of dead. In and around Victoria and Lynville, dozens of settlers. Along the trail, the bodies of captives killed on the road because they could not keep up. In the creek bottoms near Lockhart, Comanche warriors killed in the running fight, some already scalped by rangers, some left where they fell. There is no clean death count for the summer of 1840. Estimates run from around 40 settlers killed at Victoria and Lynville combined, dozens of Comanches at Plum Creek, and an untold additional number of captives who never made it back. Hundreds of horses had been recaptured by the Texans at Plum Creek. Hundreds more went north with the Comanches. Property loss at Lynville alone ran into the equivalent of millions in today's money. The port never recovered. It is not on the map anymore. The town that had been the second largest Texas port in the summer of 1840 was by the following year an abandoned stretch of grass on Lavaca Bay. One of the captives taken at Lynville was a woman named Juliet Watts. She had been shot with an arrow that struck a whalebone corset, the fashion of the day briefly saving her life. She was taken north with the war party, then recovered days later. She lived. She spoke in later years in short sentences about what she had seen. Not all of it was ever repeated. She is one of the few captives from the raid whose voice we have at all. Somewhere in the plains, a Penateka woman who had been widowed at San Antonio in March received that autumn whatever answer the raid had brought her. She is not named in any surviving record. She stands in for a category of people that the histories almost never see. She had lost her husband under a flag of truce. 6 months later, in the specific manner of her people, she had been given something in return. The record does not tell us whether it was enough. Ben McCulloch, who had helped lead the Texan force at Plum Creek, went on to a long life of frontier fighting, eventually dying as a Confederate general in 1862. He carried the summer of 1840 with him for 22 more years. Every ranger who rode into a Comanche village in the decades that followed carried Victoria and Lynville the same way, as the reason a Comanche camp full of women and children could be attacked without hesitation. That was the arithmetic of the frontier now, raid and reprisal without end. So, why ride 1,000 miles to kill one family? Because the ride was not about that family. It was about a ledger. It was about the wife of a chief killed under a flag of truce, and a son killed in a ranger raid, and a brother eaten by a Tonkawa scout in the previous generation. It was about the accumulating weight of grievances that a rifle shot could not pay. On the plains, payment took time, and distance, and ritual. The 1,000-mile ride was the interest. And the reason the women were the ones you feared most was not that they were crueler than the men. It was that they had lost the most. In a culture where every death entered a ledger, the people with the longest ledgers were the widows. When a captive was handed to them, they were not being handed a body. They were being handed a bill. The news of Victoria and Lynville traveled slowly outward by rider, then by newspaper, first through Texas, then to New Orleans, then to the eastern seaboard. The eastern papers wrote about it in horrified prose. Congress heard about it. And along a 1,000-mile line of frontier, other settlers in other isolated cabins read the accounts and did what settlers always did after such news. They loaded their rifles, they locked their doors, they slept when they slept badly. But the summer of 1840 was not the last chapter. It was not even close to the last chapter. It was the middle of a story that would run for another 40 years, and the men who would finish it, a young half-Comanche boy on the plains, a generation of rangers who would learn to fight the Comanches on their own terms, were, in the autumn of 1840, still children. The Comanches were finally forced onto reservations in 1875. The war that had run from the early 1700s, first against Apaches, then against Mexicans, then against Texans, then against the United States Army, was over. The last major war chief to come in was a man named Quanah Parker. He was, at the time of his surrender, perhaps 30 years old. He was the son of the Comanche chief Peter Nocona, the same Peter Nocona who had led retaliatory raids against Texans and Rangers in the 1850s and 60s. His mother was a white woman named Cynthia Ann Parker, taken as a child in a Comanche raid, raised Comanche, married to a Comanche chief, and torn back into white society against her will decades later. Sit with that for a moment. The last Comanche war chief was half white. His mother was a captive of the very kind of raid that begins our story. He led revenge raids on the society he was, by blood, half a member of. And when the reservation era began, he became the interlocutor between the two worlds, traveling to Washington, meeting presidents, negotiating for his people. The revenge cycle produced at its end a man who had to hold both sides of it inside his own body. His father is a smaller mystery. The Texas Rangers claimed publicly that they killed Peter Nocona at the Battle of Pease River in 1860. It was in the reports, it went into the books, but some Comanche oral histories tell a different story, that Nocona escaped that day, that the man the Rangers killed was someone else, and that Nocona died years later of illness, which is true has never been fully settled. What is not disputed is that the Rangers, when they attacked the camp at Pease River, killed women and children in numbers not unlike the numbers killed in the council house. The revenge on the Ranger side had its own ledger, and here is the piece that changes how you look at everything you have just read. The specific acts you were told about, the fires, the buried captives, the tortures on the return trail, were not a uniquely Comanche horror. They were the norm of the southern plains, practiced with local variation by many of the peoples who lived and fought there, including, in different form, by the Texas Rangers themselves. When the historian S.C. Gwynn, drawing on nearly 2 centuries of testimony, wrote about torture on the frontier, He was careful to note that these practices were indeed practiced by Indians all across the Americas, and, he might have added, practiced in some form by every side of the frontier war. The Comanches were not moral monsters against a moral world. They were the most efficient practitioners of a common set of practices in a war that had no clean sides. That does not make the specific acts less horrifying. It makes them harder to explain away as somebody else's problem. Which brings you back to that moonlit rider on the plains. He is not a monster from a movie. He is a young man riding southeast in August of 1840, with a specific list of debts in his head, in a specific culture that had a specific way of collecting them. His enemies, riding to catch him, carried lists of their own, and in the country between the two of them, in a place that used to be a port on Lavaca Bay, and in a room in San Antonio where 65 people had come under a flag of truce, the debts kept adding up, faster than any of them could ever pay. That was Comanche revenge, not madness, not savagery for its own sake, a ledger, paid in a specific currency on a plains as vast and as unforgiving as the men and women who lived on it. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the parts the textbooks flinch from, subscribe.